In the Afterlife expansion of Death's Gambit, we got some new information that confirms much of what many of us already speculated about the mysterious antagonist, Thalamus. He is an ancient, malevolent god who was exiled ages ago to another reality, essentially confirming that he is at the very least inspired by Lovecraftian lore, if not a great old one himself. He feeds on the trauma and misery of mortals, subjecting them to the same agonies again and again in an unending living nightmare. It is because of Thalamus that the ancients who lived in and beneath the lands now known as Cyrodiil obtained and used the source of immortality, and it is he who ensures it remains intact and functioning today. We know that his power and influence in the physical world grow as more mortal beings become aware of him and fall under his influence, and that he is the true antagonist of the game, opposing the natural order of life, death, and rebirth that the Crow enforces. However, Afterlife also told us some things that I personally never guessed. Thalamus doesn't work alone. He's just one of a group of terrifying foes who call themselves the Eldritch Hand. One immortal nightmare god is bad enough, but when he's just one of the forces we have to contend with, the situation goes from very bad to nearly hopeless. How can Soren ever be expected to prevail against a cabal of beings that, as far as we can tell, defy the limits of reality as we know them? Simple. He isn't. Not alone, anyway. This game has never been simply Soren versus Thalamus, or even Death versus Thalamus. There's a bigger picture here, and it was a hint given to us by the fallen mage known as the Grey Wanderer that helped clue me into it.
Now, you exist on the edge of a coin, between the afterlife and the cosmic, as Death's right hand. But there exists a counterbalance, a left hand for the exiled gods. And so you must choose. Do you fight to preserve this broken world? Or do you fight to see it reborn?
I think that concept is extremely important in understanding what's really happening here, and helping us to identify not only the identities, natures, and roles of the Eldritch Hand, but also the alliance that I'll name the Divine Hand. Before I go any further, I openly admit that a lot of what I'm going to share with you is theories, and I'm not certain that I'm right. However, I'll provide as much supporting evidence as I can to justify my conclusions. That said, here are my findings. The first member of the Eldritch Hand we'll talk about is the big man himself, Thalamus. His role in the Eldritch Hand seems to be the master. He's the one in control, the main force driving the plan forward, and the one who shows the greatest amount of raw power. As we learn from the tomes for Thalamus and Death, Thalamus tries to steal away the souls of the recently deceased and imprison them in his nightmare realm, where he can continue to feed on their trauma and soul energy. It's not 100% clear, but it seems to be that trapping these souls in his nightmare realm is how he sustains it, and how it continues to grow. Additionally, souls trapped in his nightmare can never escape, which means an unending supply of food for him. Once the living learn of him and he's able to get his claws into them, so to speak, Thalamus can also torment and feed on them. However, trapping a living being in his nightmare isn't as sustainable. Their physical body goes into a coma and will eventually die, at which point Death can usually save their soul before it transitions fully into Thalamus' realm. This is why Thalamus is so intent on maintaining the source of immortality. An immortal being is trapped between the realm of life and death. Death can't claim their soul because their body will never die, which means Thalamus can torment and feed on them for all of eternity. Thalamus' opposite is, obviously, Death, also known as the Crow. Death is the main driving force that opposes Thalamus and tries to enforce the divine order. We know from his tomes and from the B story path that those souls he reaps are taken to the afterlife, where their consciousness finds peace and contentment. Well, most of the time. Meanwhile, the energy of their soul maintains his realm, and also goes on to fuel life in other places of the universe that we mortals can't fully comprehend. I've always thought the life stream analogy that is often used in Final Fantasy is a good way to explain this sort of phenomenon. Our lives as mortals are like a pool or lake where the flowing energy of life collects and remains for a while, eventually flowing onto other bodies of water in other places, taking on different shapes and natures as it does. The divine order is that this soul energy continues to flow, probably in a massive wheel, a cycle of death and rebirth. When Thalamus disrupts this flow, he slows and weakens that cycle, potentially dimming the light of life throughout the entire universe. It's only a drop in the bucket, sure, but Thalamus is a multi-dimensional being. He's likely active on other worlds as well, trying to claim the souls away from the divine order to feed his own insatiable hunger. If this flow were to be slowed enough, and the cycle of death and rebirth damaged to a great enough degree, it's possible that life in the universe would cease to exist. It would become a realm of unlife, where nothing is born and everything is silence and suffering. This is most likely Thalamus's end goal, and likely he takes a big step toward it in the B-ending path, where, thanks to the actions of Soren, he is able to access the Soul Nexus, where the soul energy Death has been harvesting gathers and flows forward. Another interesting truth about the master role of both the Eldritch Hand and the Divine Hand is that they are limited in what they are able to directly do in the world of mortals. Death is seemingly unable to fully physically manifest except at specific locations, such as the kitchen apparently, and is obviously unable to destroy the source of immortality himself. Thalamus, likewise, is unable to enter the world of mortals and act there directly either. Just as Death has the crows to be his eyes, Thalamus is able to create an avatar of himself, but again, it's very limited in what it is able to do. Thalamus himself cannot be harmed physically, but his avatar can, since it takes on a physical form, and contains only a fraction of his true power. As for just how much this avatar can exert, I believe this is limited by how many mortals are aware of him and how powerful their faith or their fear is. Essentially, Thalamus only exists in the mortal realm as much as the mortals who live there believe that he does. So both masters need someone who can act for them in the mortal world, someone who has one foot in the living realm and one in the realm of the supernatural. They need someone to fulfill the role of an agent. For the Divine Hand, that's obviously Soren. With his immortality sustained by the crow instead of the source, Soren is able to fight unendingly toward Kier Shorai to destroy the source. He can act in the physical world, but also perceive and act in the realm of the supernatural. Additionally, he has a personal stake in ensuring the divine order is preserved. Sure, the goal of Soren's quest is to destroy the source of immortality, but we all know what really motivates him. His mother. Soren wants more than anything to find out Everly's fate and save her if he can. He also wants to live according to the ideals she left him, to live a life worth remembering. Soren doesn't know a lot about what's really going on. Death never had any intention of telling Soren about Thalamus if he could help it, since as he points out, just knowing Thalamus's name is enough to open you up to his influence. Such is the nature of Old Ones. But despite this, Soren knows just enough to do what his master needs him to do. As the Grey Wanderer pointed out though, he has an opposite. The role of the agent for the Eldritch Hand is held by Ash. Like Soren, Ash seems to exist in a state of flux that allows him to both act in the real world and the realm of spirits and souls. He's powerful too. He can wake those caught in Thalamus's nightmare, something Death himself is not able to do. Like Soren, it's clear that Ash's prime motivation is his family. Even though his adopted mother Everly was forced to abandon him to the Inquisitors to save Soren, Ash never stopped loving her. He also still sees Soren as family and wants nothing more than for Soren to be at his side when he takes revenge on the kingdom that took Everly away from him. This is all told to us directly in the game, but it leaves us with a lot of questions about Ash. There are a lot of missing pieces to his story, but I have a few theories that may help to fill them in. First, we know that there has always been something not normal about Ash. He murdered his own father brutally, not only stabbing him, but even beheading him, as we see when we find his father's corpse in the nightmare. True, while the soldiers who first came to get him said parents, we never saw his mother's corpse, and when we're restoring Soren's memories after the soul dives, the memory specifically says father, not parents. He claims he can hear otherworldly voices, and it's implied that there is something inhuman within him, something you only see if you look him in the eyes. The eyes have always been believed to be windows to the soul. Looking someone directly in the eye is a very personal, sometimes uncomfortable thing to do, and if you know what to look for, a person's eyes can tell you what they're feeling far more accurately than the expression on their face. But according to Ash, everyone who looks him in the eye seems to wind up dead. I think it's possible that Ash is actually a scion of an old one and a human. Think about it, we never hear anything about Ash's real mother, only that he killed his father. So, where is she? And who is she? Why do we never hear about her? Why don't we see her corpse in Ash's nightmare? While it could be that she's not relevant to the story, it could also be that she's not human, and even Ash doesn't know where to find her. This desire for the mother he never knew is likely why he clings so strongly to Everly, the woman who became his adopted mother. It would explain Ash's otherworldly powers, his ability to perceive the voices that told him sacrifice brings power, and his ability to step between the real world and the nightmare and even pull Soren out of it. It's a common fact of Old Ones that to see them in their truest form will almost certainly drive a normal person insane. So looking directly into Ash's eyes and seeing the horror of his soul may have a similar effect on people. It might also awaken something deep within Ash that prompts him to attack as brutally and violently as possible. Maybe subconsciously, people can detect this about him, resulting in a feeling of something feeling off, and they're avoiding his gaze. Additionally, his hair is gray even as a child, which is very unusual for such a young boy. I admit, that's a pretty out there theory, and it relies on a lot of circumstantial evidence. But you gotta admit, it fits what we know, and it would explain a lot. As for why Ash serves Thalamus, well, that's because Thalamus has convinced Ash that the crow has his mother's soul and is torturing her perpetually. You know, the thing Thalamus himself is doing right now. If Ash were to ever realize that, things would probably go poorly for Thalamus. But Ash is firmly convinced that Thalamus is the one pushing to free his mother's soul from the crow, and so Ash's loyalty, guided as Soren's is by the desire to save or avenge their mother, is firmly secured. The role of the agent is the most volatile, since it's clear that should the agent turn against their respective master, their defeat would be all but assured. Think about it. In Ending B, Soren defeats death at the very heart of his power, drawing on every source of might at his disposal. We know that Ash awakening Soren was part of Thalamus's Gambit, since he wanted to turn Soren against death, which would require him being awake. But what if Ash turned against Thalamus and started freeing more people from the nightmare? Given the relief the crow shows after Thalamus and Ash leave, we know that Ash is also very powerful, a threat even to death, and therefore a big potential threat to Thalamus as well. The next role is that of the guide. Thalamus and the crow are gods, wise and powerful in their own right, but neither of them is particularly nurturing toward their servants. Many mortal matters are probably so far beneath them that they can't even really understand the nuances of them or why they're important. They also may not be able to relate to mortals enough to really help them grasp the higher goal they're after, or their motives. Well, more the crow than Thalamus, really. The exiled god probably just doesn't care and doesn't want to deal with it. Either way, they both need someone to act as a spiritual guide to preserve, nurture, and direct the heart and soul of their chosen agent. For the Divine Hand, this is clearly Zuma, Death's acolyte and liaison to his chosen. In Sanctuary, Zuma's dialogue gives Soren some wisdom about the meaning of life. Zuma is an acolyte, a priest, one who worships and serves death by guiding those in his care and helping them to come to terms with concepts and questions they struggle with. Zuma helps Soren to understand that immortality itself does not guarantee greatness, and in fact leads to stagnation and atrophy. A life without meaning, even an eternal one, is destined to fall into decay. Zuma also seems to have more power than he lets on. When Soren arrives in the afterlife after being awakened from the nightmare by Ash, Death's first guess is that it was Zuma who got him there. Why would Death assume that, unless Zuma is more than just a humble, bongo-playing acolyte who likes flowers? Whatever powers or knowledge Zuma has, he seems to keep them hidden away, and instead acts indirectly, helping Soren find the answers himself, as a good mentor will usually do. Every member of the Divine Hand has an opposite, and the guide for the Eldritch Hand, I believe, is Nier. Nier is a big mystery, and we know very, very little about her, even compared to the other members of the Eldritch Hand. She sits in Journey's End, and even though we know for a fact she is a member of the Eldritch Hand, she doesn't seem to have any interest in impeding Soren. In fact, the way she speaks to him implies a desire to guide him and nurture his spiritual growth, albeit in a different way than Zuma. The major piece of information that makes me see her as Zuma's opposite is the fact that both she and Zuma draw completely opposing conclusions from the exact same universal truth. Zuma tells us that, immortal or not, nothing we do with our lives here is going to matter much on the universal scale. Our actions on Earth are utterly without meaning to those living on other worlds. Life has no universal purpose, and therefore it is up to each individual person to create or find meaning in their own life, as he does with his flowers. Whether acting as a spiritual guide or raising plants, the meaning Zuma has found in life is to nurture and grow the lives he comes into contact with. This seems like it's a contradiction since he serves the god of death, but remember that death is a matter of principle and is necessary for life to flourish and maintain its meaning. The wisdom Nier gives us is a bit darker. Like Zuma, she implies that there is no greater meaning to life, and if not for the compulsion to fulfill promises made, people would welcome death. She doesn't think people should find a reason to live. Nier says that it would be better to embrace murder in our heart and free people from the suffering of their meaningless existence. As I said, both Zuma and Nier have the same answer to the meaning of life, that universally speaking, there isn't one. However, the conclusions drawn from that truth are completely opposite. Zuma says to create your own. Nier says that life itself is therefore without meaning and should end. In addition to this conclusion marking her as a direct opposite of Zuma, she clearly has a supporting, guiding nature, which is pretty strange. We know she's some sort of eldritch being, and her appearance as some sort of dark dragon implies she's got some power, but she doesn't use it. She hardly does anything at all, just gives us some wisdom, and sends us on our way. Nier even seems to be disappointed if she gathers that Soren is trapped forever in the nightmare and unable to break free. Clearly she's not Soren's guide, but it's also clear she has a natural inclination to guide him, even if that guidance is ultimately to manipulate us into straying further from the crow's path. She likely acts as Ash's spiritual guide, helping him to remain firmly committed to the purpose of the Eldritch Hand and unable to break free from Thalamus' manipulation. Of course, that's basically a guess, because we never see her talk to Ash, or even appear anywhere else. She's just sitting there in Journey's End. Much like how there is clearly more going on with Zuma, and yet he never leaves the sanctuary after we rescue him and get him back there, even when the final battle comes, even when he likely knows we're trapped in the nightmare and could potentially help to break us free. It's also possible that Nier is Ash's mother, but that's basically a guess. The only real evidence I have to suggest it is from something that no longer exists in the current version of the game, so I'm just throwing it out there just in case, but I really can't back it up. It's a pure guess. The next role of the Eldritch Hand may be a bit harder to wrap our minds around, but stay with me on this one. The secret boss Zjarlathotep is an incredibly unique one as far as the game goes, both in terms of how we find him and how to fight him. He's always been a member of the Eldritch Hand, but an extremely elusive one. He didn't even appear in the game at first until the community solved the ARG puzzle to unlock him, a challenge which spanned beyond the fourth wall and into our own reality. And then, when it was possible to fight him, we had to gather things from the Nightmare Hellscape, again an alternate reality, and had to find and strike Zjarlathotep in the mortal realm. This last piece was especially tricky because, given his nature, he isn't physically there. A special unique tome, locked away beneath Garde Tomb, is the only way mortals can actually interact with him directly, and when he's struck with its magic, a fragment of him becomes physical and breaks off. All of this is just to get the chance to face him, and then when we do, well, Soren can't pin him down. Even after all that effort, when we confront him in the realm of the exiled gods, Zjarlathotep is able to escape by fleeing to another time. And then, when Soren finally does manage to seemingly defeat him, he laughs and says it's only one of infinite realities. While Garde Tomb was able to exile and seal him away, at least temporarily, with their technology, not even they could really match and confront him directly. It seems like Zjarlathotep's power puts him outside of almost everyone's reach. Almost. You see, there is one other individual with a presence in Soren's world that is just as nebulous and metaphysical as Zjarlathotep's. Someone who is able to view and influence an infinite number of timelines within Soren's world, who can know what will happen long before it does, and be an invisible guide to the agent. Without this entity, it would have been impossible for Soren to fight Zjarlathotep at all, but with their help, Soren was able to travel through time to pursue that deity. That entity, Zjarlathotep's opposite, is you, and me, and everyone else who played this game. Zjarlathotep's role for the Eldritch Hand is the Observer. Like Zjarlathotep, we are able to travel between and view multiple timelines. Every save file we have is a new timeline in Soren's world. When we watch someone streaming it or watch gameplay videos, those are other alternate timelines in Soren's world. Now you may be saying, but Lorekeeper, those are all just repetitions of the dream Soren is stuck in. If so, bear in mind that if that were true, there would only be one save file in the entire world where Soren successfully awoke and defeated Thalamus. There are many, many save files where that happened, each one likely being different in some way. Different skills or equipment, different levels of completion, different playtimes, and yet the same world and the same result. And we, the Observer, can see and act within a potentially infinite number of them. Using the information we gain from other timelines, we influence Soren's decision in whatever timeline we are actively present in, guiding him to items or altering his strategies against bosses. He can't perceive us, and we're not physically there, but we are undoubtedly exercising our will. The Observer is also clearly more than just a fancy name for the player, because the Masters are aware of us. Thalamus threatens us directly, though we can only see it by playing on PC in windowed mode, and he tried to trick us into starting a new game cycle before Soren could finish him off. Death speaks to us directly at the beginning and end of the game, and even tells Soren about our existence eventually. There's no denying that we are present in this world, even if we aren't physically there, and cannot be perceived or interacted with. The same role we take on, that of helping and guiding Soren and being the eyes and ears to events outside the normal realm of reality, is the role of Zjarlathotep. On Thalamus' Twitter, yes, Thalamus has a Twitter, he mentioned Zjarlathotep on the day the Afterlife expansion came out, saying that Zjarlathotep had foretold this day. This means that, at the very least, Zjarlohop is a source of information and foresight for the Eldritch Hand. So, a being who is of a different dimension, cannot be directly perceived or influenced by normal means, but acts as a guide and source of information and power to the agent, and ally to the master, and can freely observe and move between different timelines, and even different times within Soren's world. You see how the player and Zjarlohop are so similar, yet clearly opposing each other? We fulfill the opposing roles of the observer for the Eldritch and Divine Hands. The last member of the Eldritch Hand is a bit different. I see them as something of an honorary member, one who is given respect and status despite never taking any action. They are only ever mentioned on a tombstone in the Nightmare Hellscape. Our Father who slumbers eternally, when he awakens, all that has ever existed will end. There were several hints in the ARG that confirmed for us the other members of the Eldritch Hand, but nowhere else is this Father ever mentioned or alluded to. And yet, a hand has 5 fingers, and in the picture seen in the Parallax Nightmare Room, and at theeldritchhand.com/Zjarlohop/Thalamus/Near/Ash, there are 5 figures standing over the apparent mass of human suffering below. So at the very least, I think this entity should be mentioned along with the others, despite their detached status. Those familiar with Lovecraftian lore likely already have an idea who this Father is. I'm all but certain it's a being known as Azathoth. In Lovecraftian lore, Azathoth is an outer god, and he's pretty much the highest and most powerful of all eldritch beings. Azathoth is known by many titles, such as the Nuclear Chaos, the Lord of All, the Deep Dark, and the Blind Idiot God. That last one may seem strange, but I'll explain. You see, Azathoth is a being that exists outside of all reality, in the very center of infinity, which is a fancy way of saying he is at the core of all existence, regardless of dimension, timeline, or reality. All of reality only exists because of him. But he's asleep. He has been for a very long time, and it's only because he's sleeping that reality itself exists. Were Azathoth to ever wake up, all of reality would end. All of it. Not just the mortal realm, but all the realms of the old gods, every alternate dimension and reality that is, would suddenly not be. Essentially, all of creation is just Azathoth's dreams. There's no definite description of Azathoth's form, as every person who is aware of his existence perceives him differently. Sometimes he's described as a huge, sentient black hole, and other times as a giant ball of flesh, eyes, and sharp-toothed mouths. So why is he called the Blind Idiot God? Because despite his omnipotence, Azathoth isn't aware of what's happening in the many worlds that exist because of him. He's not watching them while he's asleep, and he has no knowledge of anything going on in them. So, blind idiot. And pretty much everyone is fine with that. Even someone like Thalamus or Zjarlohop wouldn't want Azathoth to wake up, because they would be erased as well. However, he is still an omnipotent god, worthy of worship, from an objective standpoint, and I think that's why he was mentioned here, and why we would consider him an honorary 5th member of the Eldritch Hand. Now, if Azathoth is indeed the being this stone refers to, and if he fulfills the role as Father in the Eldritch Hand, who is his opposite? Well, I think there are 2 candidates. One is Azathoth himself. Bear in mind, Azathoth exists in the center of all realities, and he's completely neutral. Our world, Soren's world, the Nightmare Realms, they all exist because of Azathoth. So he's just as much the Father of the Divine Hand as he is the Eldritch Hand. The other possibility in my mind is the 2 who are primarily responsible for the existence of Death's Gambit, White Rabbit's founders Alex and Jean. Death's Gambit is essentially their dream come to life, and while they are certainly aware of what they did or didn't put in the game, they can't know the specific details of any single timeline at any given time. Sure, if they're watching someone play on Twitch or whatever, they see that timeline, but think of how many players, each potentially having several save files, never have their gameplay seen by the devs. They are, just as Azathoth is, blind and ignorant to anything happening in any of the realities they are not directly watching, which is a vast majority of them. And, as we've seen from bug reports and such, sometimes things happen that they didn't even know were possible. So, what were to happen if they stopped dreaming? What if they stopped wanting to build and maintain these worlds that they've created for us to play in? Well, it would take some time, but those worlds would die out. No new dreams from them means no new games for us to experience, and the questions we have remaining about Soren's world and what might come next in it would never be answered. Soren's reality would end. Not all at once. Many of us would endeavor to keep it alive, but it would fade nonetheless. So maybe they fulfill the role of the Father? So, what do you think? Do you feel like I'm on the right track with these ideas of roles and opposites? Do you think Ash might be a scion of an eldritch being and a human? Do you think there's more to Zuma than he lets on, and that Nier is a spiritual guide for the forces of Thalamus? Do you think the father could be someone else, maybe a name we've never known that the devs will reveal to us one day? You spent all this time listening to my analysis of the lore and the theories I've drawn from it, so I'd love to hear what you have to say on it. If you're not already there, feel free to join the official Death's Gambit Discord, which is full of lore hunters and theory crafters, not to mention artists and others who just love this game. Or you could join the Forever Rolling Discord, hosted by yours truly. I'll have links to both down in the description. Either way, thanks for watching. Until next time, folks.